Everything in moderation doesn't work if you have an addiction. Hey, what's shaking bacon? My name's Bruno Panucci. I hope you're doing well. So when people talk about diet, they often will say, my own dad says this, everything in moderation. You know, like some people find moderation, just a little bit of everything, is a great way to go. Portion sized to a comfortable level, and you can have a bit of everything. And that works for people maybe who don't deal with addiction. For example, I never dealt with alcohol addiction. I can have a little bit of alcohol and not think twice about it. A little bit of alcohol is very satisfying for me. But to somebody else, they can't do that. Some people are just built differently when it comes to alcohol. So you might know someone that applies to in your life. Maybe it applies to you in your life. You never know what people are struggling with. And for somebody to turn around and, without realizing it, hopefully minimize what somebody else is going through, shows not just a lack of understanding or knowledge, but empathy. Some people it's alcohol. Some people it's drugs. Some people it's addiction to sex. Some people it's addiction to who knows. But it's an overwhelming compulsion people have that makes it so that they can't do something that's for their own benefit. They're doing something that is working against them. It's something that they know they shouldn't be doing. It's something they know they struggle with, but for some reason, they have this overwhelming compulsion to keep doing it. So in the case of someone who's trying to lose weight or keep weight off, that comes down to food addiction. Maybe it's an addiction to an eating disorder, like an addiction to being full all the time. When they eat, they have to eat to get full. Maybe it's someone who has an eating disorder and they constantly throw up after they eat, or they restrict fat from their diet. Like an anorexic person might often do that, and they restrict calories. And for them, that's a trigger when they correct themselves in the future after dealing with that addiction. It's an addiction to a dysfunctional way of thinking. And yes, if you have a carbohydrate addiction and you're trying to do carnivore, you have a dysfunctional way of thinking if you can't cut anything out of your diet. Think about it. You should be able to cut any food or food group out of your diet effortlessly. It should be no concern to cut out any kind of junk food for a week or 2 weeks or 2 months. It really shouldn't be a struggle, whether it's something that is an entire food group or an entire macro like proteins, carbs, or fats. If you're deciding to cut out carbohydrates or drastically reduce your carbohydrates and you're struggling with that, there's an issue. Maybe it's caffeine for other people. Everyone has something that they can relate to, I think, when it comes to something that can be addictive. Now, some things can be a little more mildly addictive, where let's say it's caffeine and you go through a couple days of feeling horrible, or maybe a week. I've never really had to worry about quitting caffeine. Alcohol, caffeine, drugs, they never called to me, but carbohydrates, that was always an issue I had to deal with. So who knows addiction better than AA? I know it can sound weird jumping to an addiction like alcoholism when we're talking about carbohydrate addiction, but if you can't cut out junk food for a week and you're constantly thinking about it, or anything along those lines where you're suffering from physical withdrawals, that means you might have more of a problem than you realize. You should be able to do it effortlessly. If I've ever decided to just not drink for a week, for whatever the reason, it was never an issue for me. I didn't miss it. I didn't think about it when I wasn't having it. But when it came to junk food or carbohydrates, I obsess over that. I can't stop thinking about my next fix. That eventually goes away. Just like when you stop drinking, that craving, that intense craving eventually goes away, and you learn to manage that and substitute those thoughts with other thoughts and other healthier habits. So what does AA have to say about alcoholism, and why does that affect us as carnivores? Well, in my experience, when I used to do acupuncture, I always understood addiction is addiction is addiction. It was virtually the same treatment plan I gave someone who is quitting alcohol or quitting cigarettes or quitting drugs. Probably 80 to 90% of the needles and the spots I hit were the same spots. There was a few different ones depending on the addiction I was treating, but for the most part, it's still an addiction. And the same thing applies when it's a food addiction as well. You're dealing with addiction. That's the core problem. It's the way you think. It's a thinking problem, not a drinking problem. It's a thinking problem, not an eating problem. And you might think this is still a bit of a leap. Well, let's break this down a little bit. Does this sound familiar with you when you're trying to cut out carbohydrates? Compulsion, control, consequences, and cravings. Those 4 things. Do you deal with that when you're cutting out carbohydrates? Do you deal with compulsion? I know I do. Now, I've been 4 years without carbohydrates, not a lick, taste, or bite of anything off a carnivore diet. But compulsion, that was the thing I struggled with the most. Think of a smoker, right? The chain smoker. All they can think about is their cigarette, their next little hit. And they have this compulsion until they get that next little cigarette. And then once they get their cigarette, as soon as they put it in their mouth, they can calm down and they feel better. So there's a psychological and chemical aspect to that. And by chemical, I mean like a dopamine reaction. You can't control your own behavior. Everybody knows smoking's not good for you, and you can't control your own behavior. You are fighting a compulsion to get that in your body. Now, can you be like that when it comes to junk food? I know I always was. I would deal with compulsion when it came to ice cream. Ice cream was a huge trigger for me, or sometimes cake, but mainly ice cream, pizza. Those are my 2 biggest ones. Any junk food, really. But those are my 2 biggest go-tos. And I just couldn't control myself. I couldn't control myself. The compulsion to get to them was enormous. And the compulsion for me, because I would eat a lot, was enormous. So it was dealing with portion sizes as well as the compulsion to just get to it. When I was finishing work, the last hour at least, I was thinking about what my next meal was going to be. And it was often, okay, I'll stop at the grocery store and I'll get this ice cream and I'll go over here and I'll pick up that pizza. And I was thinking about whatever my next hit was going to be of carbohydrates. I had no control over myself. I was 465 pounds at the time. Yes, I've lost a lot of weight. I still have more to go, but it's under control. I would give in to every single craving. Those cravings were overwhelming. I always jumped at it. I just couldn't stop myself. I was always thinking about it. The cravings were really intense, and I just went for it, not unlike a smoker with a cigarette. Does that sound familiar? Do you know anyone who smokes and someone says, everything in moderation? They get it. Anyone who has ever smoked or knows someone who smoked understands most smokers, the vast majority of smokers, can't handle smoking in moderation. You and I might be able to handle drinking in moderation, but an alcoholic can't. It's a thinking problem, not a drinking problem. They understand, once they've been sober long enough, that they can't have one drink, because one drink is a slippery slope and they're on a 2-week bender when they do that. That's what it leads to for them. And when someone has a carbohydrate addiction, the same thing happens. They have junk food or carbohydrates of some kind. And I've seen this with carnivores in carnivore groups on Facebook. They've been carnivore for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, very strict the whole time. And then they went off just once and they could never get back on. They struggled to get back on. It was worse than it originally was when they first cut out carbohydrates. And I always dealt with that because for the longest time before I became a strict carnivore, I struggled for a few years. From 2018 to 2021, I struggled with being consistent with carnivore. And what were the consequences? Well, I was overweight. I was 465 pounds. When somebody is that heavy, they're not thinking about the consequences. If they do, it gets pushed to the back burner because the compulsion and the cravings take over. And it takes over common sense. No one in their right mind would eat all that junk food when they're 465 pounds. Yeah, I showed good judgment in other areas of my life, but when it came to food, I consistently showed bad judgment. And I want you to think through this whole video about how this might relate to you, how deep your addiction goes. Maybe you didn't realize it was an addiction. Maybe you realized it was an addiction and you didn't realize the depth of it. It wasn't until I understood the depth of my addiction that I submitted to it. And I didn't take any AA classes to learn how to do that. I just one day realized it was out of my control. And once I realized it was out of my control, I submitted to it and realized I can't control it. I have to abstain from it. That's why in the carnivore world, you hear about moderators and abstainers. And I'm an abstainer. I just have to stay away from it. I'm going to read some warning signs of how to tell if you are an alcoholic. This also applies to carbohydrate addiction. So tell me if any of these things ring true to you. Drinking an excessive amount of alcohol, eating an excessive amount of carbohydrates. I had no control when it came to my volume. persistent use of alcohol despite the awareness of your problem. You can't get up to 400 pounds or 300 pounds or 250 pounds and not be able to quit and eat those foods and not think about, you know what, I really shouldn't be doing this, but you give into it. And whatever the excuses that you use to give into it, you continue to give into it knowing it's not good for you. So for an alcoholic, that would be drinking. They're drinking even though they know they have a problem. They're continuing to drink. Even though you know you're overweight and you know you need to lose some weight, you keep eating these bad foods for you. You keep making these poor food choices. Lots of time spent with alcohol-related activities. I always hear like alcoholism, most addictions are done in private. Well, not with carnivore. For me, they weren't. Some of them were. Like if I had a crazy amount of ice cream, I usually did that alone. But most of my cravings that I gave into were around social events. I could go to my family's place and I could have a big dinner, and it was usually not maybe the healthiest dinner, or maybe it wasn't such a bad dinner, but I was having too much of it. I couldn't control myself. So I was always kind of out of control at these events. When I went to a buffet, I went with friends, and I was always getting this junk food all the time. Like I had 2 big meals on my plate, one then the other, and then I'd have a whole plate of just desserts, a whole huge plate of desserts. That's 3 plates of food. It's a lot. Experiencing withdrawal symptoms. You want to find out if you have an addiction to carbohydrates? Even if mentally you think you're okay with it, cut them out for 1 week, just 1 week, and see if you struggle. Not everyone does, but often lots of people do. Some people even openly admit it when I talk to people about carnivore and I talk about the rules and it's just protein and fat and there's nothing else in my diet, no breads, no wines, no alcohols, and they stop and go, I could never do that, right? They openly admit they could never do it, but they don't want to make that sacrifice. And that's a topic for another video, but that's something you have to think about. Someone who can openly admit they don't want to cut out their alcohol at the end of the day. They don't want to cut out their bread or whatever it is that they love at the end of the day, or their pastries or whatever, because they really enjoy that part of the addiction. And that's when you know you have an addiction. You can't cut it out. And you go through withdrawals. Once you do cut it out, you're like, I do not feel good. How many people out there drink coffee and maybe they have just 1 or 2 cups a day? Maybe some people out there have 3 or 4 cups a day, and then they cut it out and you feel horrible for the next couple of days. That's called withdrawal. Your body is literally craving more of that substance to make you feel normal again. An increased tolerance to alcohol. So an increased tolerance to sugar and carbohydrates is your insulin. Your body's making more and more insulin to try and deal with your high blood sugar. So your blood sugar starts getting higher and higher, and your insulin has to work harder and harder, so it doesn't have so much of an effect on your body. Some people are insulin sensitive. Some people become more insulin resistant. We all become more insulin resistant over time because our bodies just naturally don't manage carbohydrates as we get older, as well as when we were younger, that is. So there's some people, when they don't have junk food in their diet, they could have like something sweet and just go, ooh, like that little bit, that's good. I've had too much sweetness, too much ice cream, too much of anything. They had a very small portion of it, or serving 1 cookie is enough for them. And they're not so much worried about their calories. It's just too sweet for them. But me, that's not how it worked. I could just keep going and going and going until I physically was full and couldn't handle any more carbohydrates or sugar more specifically. And that's just the way I managed my food. I had such a tolerance, both with the volume as well as the kind of food I was eating. It just was the worst choices I could make. So for some people, moderation doesn't work. In our case, when it comes to sugar and carbohydrates, just have to learn that they have to abstain. They can't manage 1 day a week with some carbohydrates. They can't manage just a mouthful or a bite here or there, because they have a mentality where it's like, I can't take it, and they have it, and then they feel like they fell off the wagon. And sometimes that can just lead into, well, I'll straighten up tomorrow. Well, you know what, I'll straighten up on Monday. Well, I'll straighten up at the end of the month. And you get this negative mindset where you keep putting off a date. And the best start date is now. The best time to clean yourself up and get rid of those addictive habits and foods is now. If you're one of those people that suffers from actual carbohydrate addiction, then you understand there is no moderation, and you have to be honest with yourself at that point. It took me years to accept the fact that I couldn't manage it, and I'm a better person for it. Now, it's not like I was, doing crazy wild things at parties and I'd lose control. I was losing control in a different way. I was losing control of my health. It was getting worse and worse, and it was spiraling out of control to the point where I had a very serious heart attack at 42 years old, and I was still eating junk food. Does that sound like an addiction to you? I couldn't stop after I had a major heart attack, because you might argue, well, somebody overdosed on drugs and they're still doing drugs. That's what an addiction does. Someone had lung cancer and they still smoke. That's what an addiction does. So it's just worthwhile to stop and do a bit of a reframe and understand where you are. Be honest with yourself if you fall into that category. If you are one of those people who can moderate, I have a friend who's a carnivore, and he always says, I'm not going to let that ruin my life. Not because he has a carbohydrate addiction. He doesn't struggle at all. He can turn around and have 3 potato chips and be satisfied. And then 10 minutes later or 20 minutes later in the movie, have another 3 potato chips and be totally content with that. He's good. I can never do that. I wish I could. I wish I had that kind of handle on my sugar and carbohydrate addiction. But this is where I am, and I'm happy to abstain. I feel better for it. I physically feel good, and it's had all sorts of positive health benefits. It's something I turned to after my heart attack, and it took me years to become strict with it because I didn't have any social media influencers out there other than Kelly Hogan. And I really learned to just try and do it on my own, and I learned the hard way trying to do it on my own. You have other people out there, and I hope you can look at my catalog of videos to see if any of them jump out to you and maybe potentially help you with some of the struggles you've gone through. Anyway, thanks a lot. Talk to you later.